Welcome to Junkyard Theory, folks. And I am not in my usual location. Yes, I'm in Gaul. So change the location just for today's episode. But today's episode is gonna be one of the most interesting ones because the guest we have on board today is somebody who was due to come on some time back. Due to some small issues, we kind of had to postpone this session a little bit. But I am so excited to have Eric Hirsch on board. Eric is an Emmy Award-winning sound designer, re-recording artist, and a sound designer. So, Eric, welcome on board the show, and Ayubowan.
Ayubowan.
Eric, so excited to have you on the show, man. And just want to start off by saying congrats on the Emmy win for Queen's Gambit.
Thank you very much. That was so exciting. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
Talk to me a bit about your origin story, because also for those of you who may not know, we've had this is the first time we're having two members of the same family on board the show. So we've had Paul Hirsch, Eric's dad, the Academy Award-winning editor, on board the show. He was one of our earliest guests, and today we got the son on board. So Eric, you come from a film background. Just walk me through the process of getting on board the motion picture industry.
Sure. So, when I was younger, I visited my father on mix stages a lot of the time. Because back then, the way that you would mix is you would mix with 35 millimeter film. And so there was a lot of downtime built into the process where you're taking this reel down and putting that reel up. So there was a pretty common thing of having ping pong tables and like little putting greens and things like that on a mix stage, which for like a little kid is really fun. So you get to go visit your dad at this big, huge movie theater looking place, and you get to play, ping pong. It's like that was a fun thing for me. And I didn't really understand the idea of what they were doing with mixing, because they would just play the same spot over and over. It just didn't make sense to me. But as I got older, I got interested in music, and I was really interested in sort of trying to understand the whole process of music, from playing music and then recording and then mixing and all that. So that got me really interested in just audio in general. And so I wanted to try and get more, I wanted to learn how to mix, basically. I didn't really know what that meant for a long time. And so I was able to get a job at a place called Sound One in New York. And it was like just an entry-level position. So I was just a runner. I was just sort of, I showed up and I didn't know anything about anything. And I was getting coffee and doing all that stuff. So I did that for a little while, and it was a really great place because, New York is a smaller film community than Los Angeles. So it's a little bit self-selecting, that it's people that want to be there and want to be doing post-production, and so when somebody comes and they express an interest in being part of that community, I think people are really receptive to that. There's a real sort of like, oh, you want this sort of, thing that not everybody's into? That's, we would love to share that with you. It's really kind of a nice thing. And especially at Sound One, I mean, there was a real tradition at that place of people starting where I started, at the bottom, and just moving their way up, staying there for a long time, and eventually becoming mixers. And there were a couple of really, really talented and really great mixers there. There was a guy named Lee Dichter, who has mixed a ton of things. I mean, he mixed like all of Woody Allen's movies. There's a guy named Tommy Fleischman who worked there for a long time. Tom Fleischman has mixed pretty much all of Martin Scorsese's films, and he's just recently mixed The Many Saints of Newark. And I mean, he's just got an incredibly long list of credits. His Silence of the Lambs, just these really amazing, wonderful mixers were there, and they were just really kind. And you could just sort of go in, you could sit every once in a while and just watch them work. So I did that. Also, I would go in the machine rooms, which were still, there was a lot of patch cables. We had moved out of 35 millimeter film by that point, so it was all just digital recorders. But there was still a lot of sort of technical ins and outs of how to program the digital recorders, how to deal with the hard drives and all this. And then there was also just patching the mix consoles. So I would sit there and I would go and I would ask the machine room operators questions, and they would fill my head, and I would just stumble out of the room completely overwhelmed with what they taught me, because there was a lot of technical stuff to know, and a lot of concepts that I just didn't have a really understanding of, because there's no real way to know about film mixing until you experience it. It's sort of it's a hard thing to grasp in the abstract. But so I would, and then I would come back and they would tell me more things, and I would come back and they'd tell me more things. And so I sort of just stuck around that place for a while. And then eventually I said, I would love, if there's a chance, if somebody leaves, I'd love to get a chance to work in the machine room. And eventually that's what happened. Somebody left. And so they knew that I had been there for a while, and I had been sort of working hard. And doing scheduling and billing and the things that keep a post-production facility running, and sort of gotten their good graces that way. And then so I got a chance to work in the machine room. So I did that for a little while. I worked in the machine room, and that was really great because I was setting up the mixes, and I was, working more closely with the mixers. It was also really interesting because I would get a chance to see sound editors' workflows a little bit. I would get a chance because you would go in, and the night before a mix is starting, you get the drives from the sound editors, and you go and you plug them in, you open up the sessions, you patch up the mix console, and then so you're looking at all the sessions. You're looking, oh, here's the dialogue editor's session. This is kind of interesting. They set it up this way. And then here's the sound effects editor's session. Oh, that's cool. That's a cool way to do it. Not really getting into, not editing myself or anything like that, but just sort of being around it and seeing it. And then also seeing the mixers, and sort of you develop an understanding of how to be in the mix studio and how they relate to the the directors and the editors and the people that are just what the communication between people is like. And there's different ways that different mixers do it. So I was able to have a chance to learn a lot about that. And then after that, at a certain point, one of the mixers at someone said, "Hey, I've got this friend who's in film school. She's got a short film. Would you like to do the sound for it?" And I said, "Sure." And I didn't know. Again, a lot of this is just jumping in and agreeing to do the thing before you know how to do the thing, which is what you have to do. So
that's a filmmaker thing again.
What's that?
It's a filmmaker thing.
Yeah, just say you know how to do the thing, and then do the thing, and then all of a sudden you know how to do the thing, which you didn't before, but now you do. So I agreed to do this short film, and it worked out okay. I did a bunch of stuff wrong, but it was fine because she was a film student herself, and we clicked. And then I had a series of short films like that, and then it was student films, and so and then eventually I got a chance to mix a feature film that Ed Burns had directed. So he directed The Brothers McMullen and a couple of other films, and so he was making sort of like he was making movies on less money, which is probably a whole other topic that would be really fascinating, I think, for a filmmaker. He really just took like this guerrilla style later in his career. It's cool what he's done. Anyway, so he needed a mixer who, like myself, was sort of like, relatively cheap, so to speak. So I got the chance to mix that film. I mixed it with my friend Greg Switlowski, who's like I've worked with a ton of times. He worked with me on the Queen's Gambit. He was a co-supervising sound editor on that show. So he and I were both at similar places in our career, sort of ready to take the leap from sort of helping people out and being ready to do the thing, and then starting to do the thing. And then after that, I got the chance to start working on Blue Bloods, which was this cop show set in New York. And so I was cutting sound effects on that. So I was cutting the sound effects and then mixing the sound effects. So that was really great education. And it was really great because the schedule was like, bang, 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 one a week, every week for 8 weeks or something like that. And then you have a week off, something like that. So you get an episode and then you cut it. And then just to do all that really, really quickly taught me a lot. And it was also really just interesting because working on a show like that, it's like going to like, sound editor boot camp. Because it's like, okay, here's this episode. You have city backgrounds. You have basic, stuff happening. And here's the next episode. Now there's a subway. How do you cut sound effects for a subway? And this you sort of think, okay, well, you put that together. In the next episode, okay, now there's a big fist fight. How do you make a fist fight sound good? And so it was working on the show was really great like that because it just gave me the chance to sort of develop the tools of mixing sound effects. And so I did that for a few years, and got the chance to watch my partner on that mixing the dialogue and the music, and you watch and you learn and you see what they're doing, and then eventually I got the chance to mix some shows myself, and then that's sort of the rest is history. That's the long version of the origin story, but I guess that
that pretty much covers everything.
Yeah.
So your process of let's say re-recording, sound designing, and mixing, all those, like you guys don't really, very rarely do you guys, I think, if probably never, y'all never really come on board during the pre-production stage. It's almost always like during the post. And I'm assuming this happens, for the most part, after picture lock.
A lot of the time that's the case, yeah. Occasionally we're on and they're still cutting, and sometimes that's because the picture they're having trouble getting to the right cut. And they didn't necessarily they wanted to be locked sooner than they were, and we were just scheduled to be in there. But generally, we're on as close to picture lock as possible. So there's not as much redundancy in the work that we do. So we're not cutting stuff and then conforming and then, doing work that isn't necessarily going to make it into the final cut. And then it also becomes, it's the kind of thing where we have to schedule a Foley artist and then loop group and things like that. So it's best to do that to as locked a cut as possible. So we like to wait until we're sort of close to the end of the process to get that in. So.
That's kind of what I was going to ask about next, Foley. So Foley, just talk to me a little bit about that. So sound design versus Foley. So you guys sometimes like pick sounds from banks, and then what you can't create, you get it from Foley. So how do you guys kind of like collaborate between these two departments and work on the sound for a particular show or a film?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality for a lot of the like creative decisions that we have to make is that there are like just budgetary constraints. So sometimes it just comes down to a question of like, what is going to be the most efficient way to do it? So, in a perfect world where we were just given an infinite budget and we could just do it, I would just give a Foley editor weeks and weeks of time and just say, do a pass, and then we would take a look at it together and say, okay, well, there's still like to cover this sound. Let's do a pass on that. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. We sort of have a limited amount of time, and Foley artists never like it when you say, here's I want you to do, because we'll send them a spot session where we'll give them little clips and say, here, this sound, cover this glass down, blah, blah, blah. And if you give them more than they can do in a certain amount of time, they'll sort of, bark back at you and say, this is too much, it's not going to work. So it's incumbent on the sound editor to do as much as he or she can without, and then the stuff that's going to be most efficiently done as Foley do it. I mean, sometimes there'll be something that an actor is doing that's kind of like, maybe they're tapping on their leg like this, doing this kind of thing, or something. I mean, or maybe there's, like an example would be on Queen's Gambit. So we had the production sound for a lot of the chess moves, and they're like library pieces. They're library recordings of chess pieces down, right? And that would have been all fine. But we were also in a position where we got the chess boards from production, which is something that's nice to do when you can. So they were like, the producer talked to the props department, and they sent us the chess boards. So we had the chess boards at our disposal. So what we were able to do is the Foley artist was able to just sort of, way more efficiently do the pieces down, and each board had different pieces that were made of different materials. This one had more felt on the bottom, like that. And then it's just, to be able to have, the Foley artist on Queen's Gambit is a woman named Rachel Chansey, who's like just incredible. She's really great. And so she was able to go through and just put a lot of nuance into it. So just, this piece down with this velocity and, this slide. And she could do that so much more quickly than we could have recorded it. So that was the kind of thing. You sort of got to pick your spots. And then there were things where like, maybe there's a cup down in the background, and we have enough sound effects, or eventually you develop a library of Foley recordings over time, and so you've had Foley artists record 20 glass downs. So you can just cut the glass down in as a sound effects editor, and then that saves them a little bit of time, and they can focus more on the things that are going to have more character and things that are going to convey more from a storytelling standpoint. The things where like the human touch and having somebody who's reacting to the picture really like elevates it in a way that, so basically you cover as much as you can without them doing it, having them do it for you, so that they can focus on the really fun stuff, or things that are like, I think one of the things that Foley really does is when it's a little tiny detail that you wouldn't necessarily notice, and then you hear a sound for it, and it's not like you notice the sound, it's just that it sounds right. That's the things that I think are really great. And when you can sort of give them time to do those nuances by getting the sort of, ordinary run-of-the-mill stuff out of the way, that's really helpful.
100%. With, sound editing, Foley, all that stuff, like for a traditional viewer, this goes without, like, you hardly ever notice it if it's done really well. Mm-hmm. And with more recently with the internet coming in, and like clips on YouTube being shared on like TikTok and all of that, like I think more prominence has been given to not just Foley artists, but also like people in the post-production stage as well. And how do you kind of like think the prominence that's given to post-production artists has kind of like changed in the past, I don't know, 2 decades, 2 or more decades that you've been involved in the industry?
That's a good question. You hear the phrase, we'll fix it in post, sort of like tossed around a lot, and that's like an old cliche and everything. But I think one of the things that I would think would probably have a big role in what you're describing would be also just like the rise of CG, just computer graphics. And so, I've seen lots of sort of, you will never believe how much of this backdrop is actually just CG, sort of shot before and after shots. And then you see that. And then people sort of realize, oh, there's this like real like army of people that are working in post-production to do this stuff. And I think that's probably played a role in it. I don't necessarily think the general public is like, or necessarily should get to like a place where they're like really thinking about sound designers and sound editors. The thing that I think is true is that there are people who care about it. And people with like directors, producers, editors, picture editors, and people for whom sound is a priority and they're really important. And those are the people that. And then there are people for whom it is not a priority. They're just sort of like, nobody wants bad sound. Bad sound is immediately apparent. That should be avoided at all costs. But then once it's not bad, they don't really care anymore. So, that's a different community of people than the people who are like, let's make this moment really elevated through the use of sound. Let's they're really paying attention to those opportunities. And so those people have sort of always been on board, and they've always sort of treated the, sound post and then obviously picture post, and they've treated us as collaborators for a long time. And, I don't know to what extent that's percolated down to the general public, but it's kind of,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Additionally, it's like, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So you get production sound, like not only what do you call sound effects from a set, but also, like, let's say the dialogue and all that. And sometimes the dialogue also has sound effects like that. It's like you said, someone tapping on that knee or something like that. So you have that, and that's overlaid with the dialogue. How do you guys kind of like, work around with that? Like, in case you probably have to kind of like, maybe you can kind of get the actor back in the studio and then dub it and then do the sound effects again. Or do you guys like just decide to go ahead with both sounds like overlaid on top on the same track? You get what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you will want to use them in conjunction because maybe the way that something is recorded we call them PFX. That's the term we use for production effects. So like a sound effect that is recorded on set, we'll call that as PFX. And sometimes PFX are great because they have a natural sound that you can never really make Foley sound quite like. I mean, great Foley artists can do great things, but there's like the certain sound when the thing happened on set. Maybe it's somebody dropped a particularly heavy prop and had a sound to it that you just don't want to. You don't even want to necessarily try to replace it. But like you said, if it's tied to dialogue, then sometimes you don't really have a choice. And one of the things that we have to do also is we have to prepare for dubbed versions. So as part of the process of like creating deliverables, we have to make a version that has, they call it a fully filled music and effects mix. And so that means that any production effects that get taken out when we take the dialogue out have to be replaced. So we will have Foley artists record all of that stuff, but it sort of depends. I mean, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. It's really just sort of let the best sound take the lead. You know what I mean? Like I don't think on principle we would say we're going to replace all the production sound with better versions of it. That's kind of a recipe for doing more work than you need to do. And sometimes you lose something. I mean, one of the things that happens occasionally is that a picture editor and a director will be used to listening to their sound for such a long time, and they'll have an attachment to it. And I don't think that that's necessarily misguided. I mean, sometimes it's temp love, and you're sort of like, I know you've been listening to this for 9 months, but it doesn't sound good. Let's try to make it better. But sometimes they're right, and sometimes there's a special thing, and I don't think it's right to say we're going to replace it because that's what we do. As I think you have to be flexible and take it on a case by case basis. But that said, we do record all that stuff just to have it there. It's the kind of thing also where you want to just better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So we'll record that stuff, and just sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. And sometimes production is just so noisy and there are buzzes and just hashy noise and stuff like that you can't really use the production effects. So yeah.
You mentioned deliverables. So sometimes I think certain studios request, not studios, but pretty much everyone kind of requests, we need the dialogue track separately. We need this, what do you call Foley, sound score separate, all of that, because sometimes certain films go into they're sent to different regions, so we essentially dub it in different languages.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, how does PFX kind of factor in?
Well, what you do is you try to just save them whenever you can, and sometimes you have no choice but to replace them with Foley, and there's just a compromise that's inherent in the process that you sort of need to live with. And in those cases, you just sort of have the Foley artist listen to the production. You'll make a note that says this is specifically for the enemy, this is for the foreign version. So listen to what the production one sounds like and try and make it sound as close as you can to it.
How closely do you guys work with the director, or do you guys ever so hardly work with them, or
it really depends. It depends on the director. I mean, some directors really like to get into the minutia of it. One of the things that you just have to that we appreciate about, or we understand about directors, is that they are dealing with every department. They're it's our sound issues are incredibly important, and we think that but we know that as a director, they're also talking about the costume, they're talking to the composers, they're talking about all kinds of things, and they're managing everything. So there's only so much time that they have. That said, some people really love to get into it, and so as a result, we'll sort of sit down, and what we do a lot of times, we'll have a spotting session where we sort of watch the film together with the director and the director and the picture editor, and we'll sort of just go through it, and we'll make notes, and we'll talk, and they'll say, oh yeah, right here we're thinking we did something. Or sometimes we'll have questions, we'll say, oh, here I noticed that there's no sound for this, we were thinking we do this. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a cool idea. Or no, we want to keep it that way for we're trying to do a particular effect that so keep it quiet there. So we'll have the spotting session, and then depending on the director, we'll play them some stuff before we get there, and then they'll be at the mix. It also, some people just don't have a lot of patience for it. So they'll just come in to the mix, and they'll just see it, and they say, okay, good, and fix this, and this, I'm going to go. And then they'll come back and they'll watch it one more time or something like that. Other people, they like just being there. They like listening while we're sort of doing a bunch of tweaks and things like that. And some directors have the ability to sort of kind of multitask, because there is some downtime on the mix stage where they're just sort of waiting for us to do something sort of tedious. So they can be looking at visual effects and other things that they have to do. They can be doing that while they're there. But it's kind of a case-by-case thing. And, a lot of the time we'll end up working more closely with the picture editor if the director is of that kind, who's sort of doing other things or not necessarily interested in being there. Picture editors, I think, in general have a more patience for tediousness a lot of time, which I think is sort of probably built into the profession of being a picture editor, most likely.
Yeah. Picture editing versus sound editing. So one side kind of deals with frames, and you guys, I don't necessarily know what you guys deal with. What's the unit that you guys kind of work around with?
Yeah, so we record sound at what's called 48,000 hertz. That's that's the sampling rate. So we basically have a frame, and then we'll break the frame into half frames and quarter frames, and it's basically like subframes. So we'll be dealing with units that are like a thousandth of a frame, or I guess more like a hundredth of a frame. And so we'll get really precise because in between the time when two frames of picture are being recorded, there's sound continuously through that little window of time. And sometimes we can make adjustments to sync or things like that. And we can move ADR or things that are not necessarily syncable in the Avid because we're working on a finer time scale. But yeah, so we're basically working in subframes, which is hundredths of a frame.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And how often does the pipeline or the workflow kind of change with software changing throughout the times and all of that?
It's been Pro Tools for a long time. One of the things that's been a sort of a recent thing, I'm trying to think about when I would say it really became prevalent. I mean, maybe about 8 years ago, it became the case that people were all mixing in Pro Tools. That was something that was possible for a long time, but not necessarily something that people were doing. So a lot of the workflow would be, you have editors they have their sessions in Pro Tools, and those are feeding a mixing console. But the mixer is not using Pro Tools. The mixer is just using like a mixing console. It's not an analog console, but it's a digital console that has its own software, and they're just, you know, records automation. They're tweaking knobs, and they're not looking at Pro Tools at all, really. And then the change, probably the biggest change that's happened since then, is that now mixers are more likely to be just mixing in Pro Tools. So we're just using a different type of mixing board, one that's not, it's not a standalone kind of a thing. It's basically like just a big mouse kind of. It's a big control surface that interacts with Pro Tools. So you're mixing in a Pro Tools session, and that's pretty much universal at this point. There are like maybe one or two super old school guys that will still mix not that way, but that's probably the biggest change, is that everything can be done inside of Pro Tools. But within that, the changes are more kind of like incremental. I guess one thing also that's a little more that's changed sort of as a result of that is that it's more likely that everything will be in one session, as opposed to having like 3 or 4 workstations that are all feeding one centralized place. It's kind of more like you import them all into one Pro Tools session, and then you just have this whole big list of tracks all in one thing. So it's a little bit more centralized in the mixer's control. And I think that's also sort of coincided with mixers having to, you know, by necessity and by desire, developing more editing skills. So there's more of an overlap between the mixing skill set and the editing skill set. And I think that's a real change. And I think that's probably, like, at this point, taken root completely. But for a long time, it was not necessarily the case. You would have mixers who, when needing to edit something, they would just, you know, don't really know anything about how to do it. And editors that are sort of like, I don't understand what you're doing when you're mixing. Whereas now, you know, like for me, I'm somebody who I'll edit and mix as much as, you know, all the time. And I sort of am equally comfortable with both of them. And I think a lot of mixers at this point have at least some degree of comfort and familiarity with the sort of like basic editing in Pro Tools. Whereas 10 years ago, that would not be a safe assumption at all.
Fair enough. Yeah. So when you work on a project, you work for months sometimes. And this is a term that I kind of caught from your dad. You tend to become snowblind. Snowblind.
That's a good term. That's a good way to put it. Totally.
Yeah. How often do you guys encounter this, and how do you work around it?
Well, one of the things that's helpful is that we are less likely to be on really long term than the picture department is. So the picture department is more likely to, you know, have the chance to become snowblind than we do. And I guess in a way, we kind of just have to take our chances with it. I don't know that there's really a great way to combat that. You know, I mean, I think in a way, though, I think the fact that our goals are somewhat more modest than those of a picture editor helps, you know what I mean? Because when a picture editor gets snowblind, it's sort of like, this doesn't make any sense. The story is muddled. If somebody's watching the movie, they can't follow it. You know, the stakes are a little bit higher in terms of being like, this works as a really solid piece of storytelling that affects people versus like, what the heck is going on? I don't get it. Whereas for us, if we sort of become snowblind, it's kind of like, there's too much sound going on. Take some of that sound out. You know what I mean? Like it's easier for us to sort of, you know, if we get lost. I mean, I guess the sort of the way that a sound team would get snowblind would be, we would just put a bunch of sound in, and we would just keep putting more stuff and take the film in a direction that it didn't necessarily need to be in. But the solution to that is much easier than the solution for, like, you know, if a picture editor, if they're cutting for a long time and then they do a test screening and the audience is like, what are you guys doing here? What is this? They've got a bigger problem on their hands because they have to go back and maybe there are reshoots involved. Maybe it's just, you know, what do we do? Maybe there are limitations to how much they can even solve it. Whereas if we we present something and it's sort of, there's a record scratch, everybody's like, what was that? Why does this sound so bad? It's sort of easier for us to just be like, okay, well, we'll take this out. Let's start over. We'll back off on this. Maybe we'll do a different pass of this. You know, our fixes are a little bit more, you know, manageable in general and sort of limited in scope because.
Yeah. You also mentioned sometimes there's probably too much sound in there, and the solution might be like take some of it out, and that kind of reminded me of like a few moments in Queen's Gambit where there's not as much sound, but you guys kind of create that tension, the atmosphere. You build up the moment with silence as well. So talk to me a little bit about like the role of silence within the mixing stage or like the design stage itself.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just out of necessity. So Queen's Gambit is a really unusual project because you have people playing chess, right? And so let's say you have people watching them. The people that are spectators at a chess game are expected to be very quiet. There's like, if somebody starts talking, there's so we don't. And the people that are playing the chess are not standing or moving around, generally speaking. So you have two seated people surrounded by a crowd of silent people in a generally quiet room. So, part of that is like we sort of have no choice but to do that. The thing to do as a responsible sound editor is to not fight that. You sort of like, part of it is just, I think you just have to be in communication with the picture. Like, it's almost like the picture sends you something and then you respond to that. You sort of like, you don't necessarily want to like lead the picture. You sort of, okay, what am I getting from what's on the screen? And then what can I respond back to that, and sometimes it just has to be silence. And it helps that the way that it's cut, I mean, if it's cutting at a tense moment. And then Queen's Gambit, we were also really helped up with the fact that the score is just beautiful and the score is doing a lot of work, and the composer did such a great job, so we could be kind of silent and just let the music take over. But sometimes, it's a question of like having the confidence in your craft to be like, I know that there's no sound here, and like I'm not going to put sound just so that you remember that I'm doing something, because I think that it's better without it. I think you just have to trust the audience and be faithful to what you're getting from the picture, and don't sort of like, I don't know, there's nothing happening, but we got to put something because we're sound editors. We got to look for a place to put sound, to fight that instinct and to sort of be at peace with like the picture and be true to what it is. I think it's an important goal.
Just talking to you and some of these things that you mentioned kind of resonate with me, because we are in post-production on this particular show that we shot recently, which I was telling you about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are, some of these moments like from previous films as well, where you know that like this particular moment's gonna work once the sound design, sound effects, all that stuff comes in. But as a picture edit alone, it just looks and feels a bit weird. So how often do you guys get stuff like that from the picture department, where they're like, this moment might not seem like it works visually, but see what you guys can probably do with it and like make it work?
Yeah, that does happen a lot. And not to keep harping on Queen's Gambit, but one of the things that is interesting about the process that Scott Frank and his picture editor Michelle Sosoro did on that is they will not put in any of their own temp sound effects when they're cutting. So generally you have, the picture editor or their assistants will be putting in temp sound effects as kind of like placeholders. But for them, we started actually really early on that. So we started when they were still doing the like picture assembly, before even the picture editor's like cut of each episode was on. So we were on really early. So they were working with the temp sound. So as a result, they were able to cut those moments because of the exact process that or the problem that you're talking about. Here's this moment. We don't know if the cut is going to work. Maybe it's going to work when the sound comes in, but we're going to trust you. They would say, okay, do the thing now. And then they would keep cutting, and they were able to keep working on it. And then they would send it back to me and say, okay, now make it a little more like this. And we would make it a little more like that, because they wanted that to be part of the process of making those moments work. But more frequently what will happen is there will be those moments, and the picture editors will reach out to us and say, sort of early on before we've started the real thing, and they'll say, hey, we've got this scene. We just need some help. And that's something that, of course, we're always happy to do, just because we're all one big team and we're all trying to make it work. So it's more often the case that they will, like, it's less often the case that they'll just sort of be like, the sound is totally wrong and we don't have anything, but here you go. It's more likely that they will come to us sooner and be like, hey, listen, can you try and do a thing? Even if it's just a placeholder that we're constructing that's a little bit more sort of sophisticated than they may not have time for, because there's not necessarily always time for a picture editor or their assistant to be doing those things. But, don't be afraid to lean on the sound department and say, hey, help us out. This moment is not going to work. And we need, because it's good for the picture editor, I think, to be able to cut after having that feedback from, okay, I think that this is going to work when the sound comes. And then maybe the sound comes, they're like, oh, well, I thought it was going to work, but now that I'm hearing it with the sound, it doesn't work in exactly the right way. But if I was to do this, and maybe this is a little bit shorter, maybe we go to this shot in between, maybe that does make it work. Now that I have the sound, I understand that. So to not be able to do that until the very end is sort of putting yourself at a disadvantage, I think. So
it's amazing how collaborative things can be, right? I mean, like even during the post-production stage, like if you have a big team working on it, they send you like a cut and see what you can do with it, or else like it just works back and forth. So that's so cool.
Yeah.
And then you have the limitations that come with working on a TV show where you are most of the time trying to meet like a shorter deadline than if you would probably be working with a feature film.
Yeah.
So talk to me a bit about like how that dynamic differs, TV versus cinema.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think the biggest thing is probably just the time scale. I mean, on a film, we will be on it for weeks and weeks versus, a TV show. And again, I think it just sort of it comes down to the expectations of the showrunner being properly calibrated for knowing what's possible in what amount of time, and then this is actually, I mean, this is something that we discuss a lot amongst ourselves, because you want to just do everything. You want to get rid of every little bad noise and put every good noise in and make every moment perfect. And you just find, if you do that, then you're going to run out of time, or you're going to just wind up putting in a bunch of extra time, which like is great because you have a fulfilling thing and the mix sounds great and you've done everything, you've checked every box that you possibly could, but you're sort of working outside of the constraints of the budget, and it's not necessarily fair to the person doing all that extra work, So we sort of have, I've been having this conversation a lot recently, because we have to sort of like reel it in a little bit, be like, okay, you have to, I guess you just have to pick your battles is the best way to put it. You sort of say like, this is the big moment in this episode where I want sound has to be just right. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this and a little bit less time on this other thing. It's sort of like, I guess, in animation where you focus in on some of the background shots and it's just like totally blurry. They said these placeholder kinds of things because there's something so much bigger in the foreground that's moving quickly that your eye will literally not be able to perceive the other thing. So, it's sort of, I think working on an accelerated time scale the way you do on TV requires you to develop that kind of a selectivity and a vision to be like, this is in the background, just don't get stuck on it. And this is in the foreground, make it beautiful, make it great, But it's a process. It's just trial and error, I think.
Speaking of trial and error, do you guys also kind of like decide if the score works or not? I mean, like sometimes it might be like this beautiful piece, but it might not sometimes, work with that particular scene. So maybe like tone it down or like completely remove it. Has that happened? And if so, how do you deal with like any possible, what do you call it? Repercussions?
Well, here's that. I mean, so first of all, that happens all the time. I mean, as you are well aware. The thing is that you have to assume that everybody that's working on the project wants it to be as best as it can, and I mean, that happens a lot. It really does. And sometimes it's a question of this score is just coming in way too early. We're not playing the right moment. This is not the emotion that we want to heighten. But if it starts 30 seconds later, so then there's like half the cue is gone, and but composers, I think, are like, the thing about being a film composer as opposed to just being like, I'm going to go compose my own pieces for an orchestra and make it work, is you have to accept that it's not your thing. I mean, it's a thing that takes on a life of its own and is collaborative. And those times when we take a cue out completely, which we do for sure, because we're sort of like, what is this cue doing? You know, the composers, they just understand. I think they're sort of like, maybe they're just really good at, you know, putting on a brave face and going and crying at home because their beautiful piece of music got taken out. But they're generally, they accept it, you know what I mean? And the other thing about it also is that we don't necessarily always have the composer there with us, you know? And so like, we're sort of like, listen, this scene is going to play better with no score. Then the composer is probably has moved on by that point. You know what I mean? Like sometimes they're still there. And, you know, there was a show I did a few years ago where the composer was in every mix, and it was actually really great. We would, you know, it was collaborative, and he was not precious about it. He was not sort of like, no, that has to stay in. He was very open and receptive. But again, that's the kind of thing where, you know, producers are producers because they have the ability to communicate effectively with lots of different people. And sometimes that requires, you know, delivering news that people might not like. But on the whole, I think it's less of a problem than you might think. You know, I mean, composers are used to writing things that then, no, I don't like this, give me another version. And sometimes they have to deal, you know, composers also have to deal with people who are not necessarily articulate with music, giving them notes about things. And, you know, I just wish it was more, I don't know, not this, you know, that like composers will get notes like that sometimes, and they just have to deal with it. So, you know, composers have thick enough skin and sort of, you know, they know that it's just built into the process that sometimes they're going to write a beautiful thing and it's not going to work. There was a funny story, like there was some, I forget what movie it was, but this is like a story that I heard from the people that worked at someone where there was like this sequence where a plane crashes into a lake, and they were playing it back for the director, and some technical thing went wrong and the sound effects didn't play. And it was just the score, and the director's like, I love it. And they put together this whole thing of like, you know, this plane hitting the water and the boat, like it's just big sound effects tour de force. But like once you play it and it's right, like you just got to deal with it, you know what I mean? And so that was it. They just played it with no sound effects. You know, they were like, this works better as a moment. This is purely score. It's just, it works. So, you know, sometimes it's harder to stomach than other times, but you just got to go with it.
It's very subjective, right? I mean, like even inside them, like within one single project, you might have those moments where, yeah, you need more of the score here, you need more sound effects here, then you need silence here, and then sometimes the director is probably too married to like maybe the score or like a piece of dialogue or whatever. Whereas like sometimes it could possibly work without anything as silent. Like, who knows? But for you guys, it's all about, you know, again, seeing the bigger picture and seeing what kind of works or tells that story better. So do you guys, you know, storytelling wise, do you get the script at all, or do you just look at what's on there and work with that?
We will get the script sometimes, but it's more likely the case that we'll just see the cut, because there are things that'll be in the script. I mean, it helps to read the script in order to get, sometimes there's a piece of stage direction or something like that that is not necessarily visible on screen, but it helps you understand the character's motivation, or you sort of, sometimes it's the case that what they shot didn't quite capture what they were going for, but having read the script and knowing what they were going for, you can sort of help fill in the details a little bit. It's sort of like, you know, so-and-so storms in and then storms into the room, but like, that's how it's written in the script, but then the character walks in and they're not as mad as maybe they wanted to be. Maybe they didn't get the right coverage and then that you can raise the footsteps or do things like that, that sort of, it does help to provide context, but more likely we're just sort of waiting until we get the picture turned over. That's our sort of starting point.
With you know, alternating genres, like, yeah, you have drama, which Queensgamer kind of falls under, but then you come to some of the genre like horror, where sound is like paramount. If you miss something, like it's a hit or a miss, right? Like with horror, if you don't really land that sound effect. So how do you guys kind of, you know, I think what I'm trying to ask is how much of reference do you guys do with material that's like already been done out there, and kind of not try to emulate it, but you know, you look at it for reference, you listen to it for reference, and then you decide, all right, how are we going to adapt it and make it unique for this particular project? How often does that happen, and if so, like what's that process like for you guys?
That's a good question, but I don't know that I necessarily like consciously think about it in quite that fashion. Like you're sort of always listening to mixes, and you hear a mix and you're like, wow, that's really great, that's really cool. There are also, there's sort of like storytelling. There are like certain like sound tropes, I guess you could say, like certain like sound things that people go for. Like there's the tinnitus ringing in your head kind of sound, right? Like that's something you've probably seen in, dozens of movies, and there's lots of different ways that you can do it. So there was a project where we had that kind of a thing where a character would have these spells where she would sort of have that ringing, and it was sort of like, okay, well, how does it set, how do we make this not just the same thing? So it was listening to, finding examples of that happening in other movies and being like, what can we do to make this its own thing? But otherwise, I guess it's just sort of, I think it's more unconscious. I don't know that I necessarily have a good answer about like how the process for like assimilating ideas so much is just sort of like always being like, oh, that's a cool way to do things. So I guess sometimes you just hear it, and it just becomes part of your understanding of the palette, kind of like, here's the range of options. So, I guess one of the things that I hear a lot of the time is, or that I'll listen for a lot of the time, is how much sound is, or just the range between, like we were talking about earlier about silence, like how comfortable people will be with putting in less sound, or or how comfortable they'll be with just putting in like a lot of sound. Like, wow, this is so much, this environment that they're for this scene is so much louder than I would ever think to do it. That's such an interesting choice. And then it makes me think like, oh, next time I'm cutting a scene that's kind of a similar thing, I have the option of going to that extreme of dynamics, where it's like much more busy and loud, and just understanding what that's like. I guess in a way, it's sort of, I guess what it does is it gives you a chance for other people to do some of the trial and error for you, kind of, you sort of see like what it's like. Oh, this is what that sounds like. Okay, that's cool. Or, oh, this is when you do this, this is how it sounds like. I'm not really that into this right now. Like one of the things that was actually really interesting is, so like Uncut Gems, was really great sound job. And one of the things that they did that was sort of really unusual is it's pretty much a convention that a lot of the time the dialogue is in the center speaker, right? And the dialogue stays in the center speaker. Sometimes somebody moves to the left and the dialogue moves to the left speaker with them, but most of the time that's not really the case. And part of that is just because of the fact that, like, because you usually have, maybe you have two boom mics, but you have one boom mic, and the boom mic, if it all pans to the left, and like it just sounds kind of unbalanced and weird. Sometimes if you have lots of ADR, then you can have it panning all over the place. There's other examples like Birdman and Roma, where like there's really a deliberate attempt to do panning. But Uncut Gems was one of the first films that I've seen where they were really doing a thing where like you have this character's on this part of the screen, this character's on this part of the screen, and their dialogue was panned like apart from each other. And there was it was really extreme. And it was something that I'd always been curious about. I was sort of like always wondering, and seeing it in practice, I was kind of like, it's a little, I don't know that it necessarily, it was just it was really cool to be able to see that put into practice. I'd never seen that before, because it's not the kind of thing it's something that a director would have to very specifically want to do. And I'm sure that the Safdie brothers sort of like specifically wanted that kind of a thing, and kind of an effect, because if you would do it normally, people would be like, what's going on with the dialogue? Why is there, it's coming out of that speaker? What's the deal? But so having the chance to see them do that, it was like, oh, that's how that sounds. Okay, cool. Now I know.
Yeah. It's not very often that you see conventions being broken, or something new and innovative.
Yeah.
The approaches like that come out, because you don't necessarily think of it initially, but I guess that kind of stuff, those seeds are again planted within the pre-production stage, I guess, like if the director is like asking for it, or maybe it might be like you said, even something that arises from a mistake, like the plane crash.
Yeah.
So yeah. I've been curious about, you mentioned genre tropes and stuff like that, but what about cliches? So you have the Wilhelm scream, and then there's
Right. I
that
mean,
other, yeah, you have the bird. I can't remember what the bird.
yeah, it's like a red-tailed hawk.
Yeah. And you have that sound like, play in scenes from a region in the world where you don't have that bird, and like sometimes on alien planets and stuff,
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, it works. It just fits that moment sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think is interesting, I said earlier that, the general public doesn't really have that much of an understanding of sound, but I do think that people have sort of internalized the vocabulary of sounds. And so you hear that red-tailed hawk, and because you've heard it so much, you're sort of like, oh, okay, we're like in a big, huge POV of a natural vista kind of thing. So I do think this serves to communicate a little bit. I mean, there's a show, I forget what the name of the show was, it's going to come to me in a minute, but it was actually a show that took place in like the post-production world. And there was like the sound there. One of the characters is a sound designer, and he goes and he records this coyote. He was like hiking one day, and there's a coyote, and he records the coyote. He's like, wow, this is such a great sound. And then he goes and he puts it into the show that he's working on. The director's like, no, I want a coyote sound. He's like, yeah, that is a coyote. I just recorded the coyote. It's like, no. I want like, oh, and the guy, he's like, oh, that's a wolf. And the guy's like, yeah, put that. And so he plays the wolf sound. And the guy's like, no, yeah, that's the coyote sound that I wanted. So it's sort of like at a certain point you have to yield to the fact that it doesn't matter if it is a coyote, because if it doesn't sound like a coyote to that person, it's not a coyote. I mean, it's not a coyote. So you sort of have to work with the vocabulary that people have absorbed to a large extent. I mean, it's the Wilhelm scream is one of those things that has made its way into popular consciousness, and like some people are really into it, and it's like, I've never really participated in the sort of like, let's hide that thing there,
Yeah.
But I do think the thing about the regional birds is like, I don't know. See, this is the thing where you sort of have to like balance. You're balancing who cares, in a way, to put it kind of bluntly, and like how much time do you have and how much does it mean to you, right? Like there are some directors for whom you can say, okay, so listen, I did some research, and the birds that I put in are birds that are native to the region that you're shooting in. That's like, great, I love that. I'm so glad that you did that. And there's some directors who will be like, yeah, it's okay, birds, that's cool, And then so it becomes a question of, do you want to do that research anyway? Is it important to you as a sort of like, I'm doing this thing, I might as well do it the right way. Should I, And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. It also just comes down to like, how much time do you have, and what's important. I mean, you have to pick your battles again. I think that's a big part of it.
This is a question that I would normally ask a little bit earlier, but it just popped into my mind right now. Do you have any skills that come from different other backgrounds, some other discipline that has essentially transferred into sound editing, re-recording, designing, all of that stuff that's worlds apart, but yet helps you perform or become a much better artist?
I'm not sure that I necessarily, I don't know that I do necessarily. I mean, being a musician is really important also, because, part of mixing dialogue really well, I think, is just identifying frequencies. And part of that is just like hearing, and, you practice hearing, working on music, and, understanding. That also helps you mix music better, I think, obviously. But it helps with dialogue in a lot of ways, because you can sort of there's this tone in the background, I want to get it out, and being able to sort of isolate that tone and find the frequency is like, helps to have that musical background. So that's important. I don't even necessarily know that I have that many skills that are worlds apart that I could draw from. So I guess my options would be limited for those. But
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I know tools are like really important when it comes to the craft that you work with, but then there's a thing where you're like, it's not the tools, it's how you use them. I mean, that definitely is true to that, but I think I read up somewhere that Netflix handed you guys, like everyone who was working on the sound team, like the same pair of headphones, so that you guys kind of like stick you have sort of like a baseline to function with. Just talk to me a little bit about tools and that versus the various skills that people bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean, so Queensgamer was an unusual project in that it was done at the height of the pandemic. I mean, we were working. I started in January 2020, and so we were planning on finishing in June. We ended up finishing it in August, but like we got sent home right in the thick of it. So we were all working in different places. Normally, there wouldn't even be an issue. Like the whole let's all have the same headphones thing is not a thing because we're not working on headphones. We're all like, before the pandemic, it was like, hey, walk 20 feet down the hall and listen to this thing because we're in the same room with each other. That said, so I do think that there's like a lot of truth, obviously, to what you said about it's not the tools, but how you use them. But I think that the fact that like Pro Tools has gotten so sophisticated and so at the same time very sophisticated and also universally available, I think has helped democratize things in some ways, because like anybody can open it up, and you don't really need to have a bazillion dollar setup. I mean, when I am mixing, like I do have like a nice piece of equipment that has knobs and things. If I didn't have that, there's a lot of people that don't have that make amazing mixes. There's some people that have that stuff and they don't even use it. There's a guy, Skip Leafsay, who's like this amazing sound designer, sound editor. He's like worked on Coen Brothers movies and all kinds of stuff. He's just got he's one of the most gifted people. He'll just sit there. He's just using a mouse. I mean, that's his thing. He'll click, 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 like, and it sounds great. He does, because it's the craftsman. I mean, not the tools necessarily. But I think having the tools at people's disposal is great. I think it helps. It helps make it more possible for people to acquire skills.
So, re-recording, mixing, designing, like you have these three. Which one happens to be your favorite and why?
I think designing, because you're sort of, it's like when you're coming up with a cool sound, it could be anything, and you're sort of like, one of the things that's the starting point for a lot of the time is you're just going through sounds. You're just listening to something, listening to this, listening to this, listening to, oh, that's cool, I'll take that. And then you're sort of like, okay, well, that's got a really great bass component to it, but it's a little bit muddy if I put this other thing that's on top of it. And finding the right combination of sounds to like sell an atmosphere is a really satisfying thing, So I guess the designing is probably the most fun, It's also the point at the point in time where you're sort of left to your own devices a lot of the time. You're sort of just sitting and playing, so there's less stress, which is helpful. I mean, mixing is kind of like, a room full of people sitting behind you waiting for you to do it right, and, make it good, so that, which is fun and it's great and I love doing it, but it's a little more stressful than the part where you're just designing it, just sort of sitting back and going to another world and listening to stuff.
That's where you get in the flow, and that's where most of the creative stuff starts happening, right? Anyway, so
totally,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what do you think is kind of like in store for you with the future? And how do I put this out? Would you necessarily stick to these three fields, or would you kind of like venture out into something bigger, like, I don't know, directing your own movie?
I don't think I would ever do that, to be honest. I do think, it's interesting because there's like an overlap between because some part of sound, post-production sound, is just technical, right? We're just cleaning it up. We're taking the thing that sounds bad and we're making it sound good. And as technology progresses, and there's a company called Izotope that makes this software that's like unreal. It just does things that's like, we rely on it all the time, and it's just getting better and better. And at a certain point, I really wouldn't be surprised if a large part of what we do just gets like turned into like a plugin, you know. So in that sense, I don't necessarily think that like I'm going to be doing this forever. And but I do think that like one of the things that would be an interesting thing would be to sort of, you know, merge composing with sound design and have just one sort of singular point from which you're generating the entire soundtrack, you know. Like I've sort of dabbled in composing a little bit, and my wife is a music editor and she's dabbled in composing too, and sort of the idea of being like, we're just going to do the whole thing, we're going to like make the music, and when you're sort of working on a project that's really creatively fulfilling from a sound point of view, there's sort of overlap, you know. The music is kind of like, the sound is like music, you know, it's sort of doing the same kind of thing, and there's a fluid barrier between the two, and it's just nice. It would be nice to sort of do that. I think that would be a nice next logical sort of place to go. But as far as it's just such a cloistered thing. I mean, sometimes we'll go to rap parties and we're sort of confronted with like the carpenters and the electricians and the camera people, and we're sort of like, oh, this is like a whole like operation. Like people, like we just go and like sit in a dark room with computers and like it's like playing, you know, a video game or something. But our experience of it is so different than what you know, like filmmakers do. I don't necessarily know that I would be up for that whole. I mean, it seems great and I love it. I have so much respect for it and it seems fun, but I don't necessarily know that that's where my like affinity lies.
It's a very nice thing that you kind of mentioned before with sound design being merged with you know, the scoring, because the guy I work with for composing, that's kind of like what he does in a way. He kind of merges in like sound design into his particular score.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I just love it. Like you said, that essentially seems like the next logical step. So I think things are kind of like moving towards that direction.
Yeah.
And yeah, man, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
This has been really enlightening. That's so much I learned, and I'm sure pretty much everyone who's been listening to this session also has. So yeah, Eric, thank you so much again, and I'm pretty sure we'll be hearing more of you soon.
Great, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. Till then, this is Junkyard Theory, folks.
Thank you.